I never intended to become a collector of nightmares. 15 years working as a night security guard at Riverside Medical Center was supposed to be just a job, a way to pay the bills while everyone else slept. But when you spend enough time in the dark, you start to notice things. Things that shouldn't be there. Things that don't make sense in the light of day. It started with a blog. Simple enough, right? Just a place to document the strange occurrences that seem to follow us night workers like shadows. I thought I was alone in my experiences until the emails started coming in. First a handful, then dozens. Now, hundreds. Each one more disturbing than the last. Tonight, as I sit in my security booth watching the monitors flicker with their usual static, I'm going to share these stories with you. But I have to warn you, since I started collecting them, something has changed. The darkness feels heavier. The shadows move differently. And sometimes when I'm alone on my rounds, I swear I can hear whispers in languages that no human tongue should be able to speak. Sarah Chen's story was the first one that made me realize I wasn't just collecting ghost stories, I was documenting something far more sinister. "I've been working in hospital maintenance for 12 years, her email began. "The basement of St. Mary's is my domain from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. I know every pipe, every electrical panel, every storage room. Or at least I thought I did. It was 3 months ago when Sarah first noticed the new door. She'd walked past that section of wall thousands of times before, but that night there it was. A heavy metal door with no markings, no window, no sign of what lay behind it. I checked the building plans," she wrote. "That door shouldn't exist. The wall is load-bearing, there can't be a room there. But every night it's there, and every night I hear something scratching at it from the other side." Sarah attached photos to her email. They showed a perfectly normal hospital basement wall, no door. But I believe her, because what happened next defies explanation. Last week I brought in a camera to document it. The door appeared as usual, but when I tried to photograph it, my phone died. Not just died, it melted in my hand, and that's when I heard it speak. The voice, she said, wasn't coming from behind the door anymore. It was coming from inside her head, a voice that spoke in numbers and static, in the sound of medical equipment failing and flat lines beeping. It told her stories of every patient who had ever died in that hospital, how their last moments of fear and pain had seeped into the foundation, feeding something that had been growing there since the hospital's construction in 1927. "I quit that night," Sarah's email concluded, "but the voice hasn't stopped. And now in my apartment I've started noticing new doors where there shouldn't be any." James Rodriguez's account came next. A subway conductor on the midnight shift in Chicago, James had spent 8 years guiding trains through the city's underground arteries. His story made me realize that what we were dealing with wasn't isolated to any one location. "The last train of the night always feels different," he wrote. "The fluorescent lights flicker more, the tunnel walls seem closer, and the darkness between stations feels thicker, like it's pressing against the windows." But it was on March 15th that everything changed. James was making his final run when he noticed something odd about the tunnel ahead. It seemed to stretch longer than usual. The next station, normally a 4-minute ride away, didn't appear after 5 minutes, or 10, or 20. The passengers didn't notice at first, his email continued. They were all looking down at their phones or dozing off, but I noticed something else. Their reflections in the windows weren't matching their movements anymore. In the glass, James watched as the reflections began to age, rapidly. Skin withered, hair grayed, bodies hunched and twisted. But the actual passengers remained unchanged, unaware of their decaying doubles. "I tried to stop the train," James wrote, "but the brake lever crumbled in my hand like ancient paper. The speedometer kept climbing. 50 May, 70 May, 90 May. The tunnel walls became a blur of twisted faces and reaching hands. When the train finally stopped, it was at a station James had never seen before. The platform was empty except for a single figure standing in the shadows. A tall, thin entity wearing what looked like an old conductor's uniform. Its face, James said, was a swirling mass of numbers and static, like a television tuned to a dead channel. It tipped its hat to me," James wrote, "and then everything went black. I woke up in the train depot, my shift apparently over, but something came back with me. Now, every night when I look in my rearview mirrors, I see that figure, standing behind me, wearing my face like a mask that doesn't quite fit." My own experience began to intensify after reading Lisa Wong's story. As a night shift supervisor at a high-end department store, she monitored a wall of security feeds showing empty aisles and silent displays. But one night, she noticed something odd about camera 12. The mannequins moved, she wrote. Not all at once and not obviously. Just subtle changes between frames. A turned head, a shifted arm, a changed expression. I know what you're thinking. Old security systems can glitch. Camera feeds can freeze and jump. But what Lisa described next made my blood run cold, because I'd started noticing the same thing in my own monitors. The movements began to form. Patterns, her email explained. The mannequins were performing some kind of ritual, arranging themselves in complex geometric shapes. And in the center of these formations, a darkness began to grow. Not just shadow, this was something deeper. Something that seemed to swallow light itself. Lisa attached several video clips to her email. Most showed normal store footage, but one showed something that still haunts me. In the grainy, black and white footage, the mannequins had formed a perfect circle. In the center, a figure lay on the floor. It looked human, but its movements were wrong, jerky and insectoid. As the timestamp rolled forward, the figure began to multiply, splitting and dividing like a cell under a microscope. The next morning, all the mannequins were back in their proper places, Lisa wrote. But we found handprints on the security glass, hundreds of them, pressed from the inside of the monitors, and they're still warm to the touch. Marcus Thompson's story arrived in my inbox on a particularly dark night, when the static in my own security monitors seemed more alive than usual. As a late-night radio DJ in a small town in Montana, Marcus spent his shifts alone in a broadcast booth, playing music for insomniacs and long-haul truckers. The station's been around since the 1950s, he wrote. Some nights, when I'm queuing up songs, I can hear old broadcasts bleeding through, news reports about events that never happened, weather forecasts for storms that never came, traffic, updates for roads that don't exist. But it was what happened during the solar storm that truly terrified him. As the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of ghostly green, Marcus's equipment began picking up something else. It started as whispers between songs. His email continued. Voices speaking in synchronization, giving coordinates and times. Then the voices began describing listeners by name, detailing their exact locations, what they were wearing, what they were thinking. Marcus attached an audio file. I shouldn't have played it. The voices, they weren't human. They had the rhythm of speech but the texture of radio static, like thousands of dead channels speaking in unison. And they knew things, private things, secret things, things buried so deep that even those who lived them had forgotten. The solar storm passed, but the voices didn't stop, Marcus wrote. They're always there now, under every song, behind every commercial. And the worst part, listeners have started calling in, telling me how much they love the new background music. They can't hear the voices, but they're changing. Every night more of them call in speaking in that same static-filled tone. Chapter 6. The Mining Elevator. The deeper I dug into these stories, the more I realized they were connected. Like pieces of a vast dark puzzle, each account revealed another aspect of something ancient and patient, something that had been waiting in the shadows of our night shifts all along. Carlos Mendoza's story arrived just yesterday. A mining elevator operator in Nevada. Carlos worked the graveyard shift, ferrying miners and equipment between the surface and the depths. The descent always takes exactly 12 minutes, he wrote. But last Tuesday, something changed. The digital display showing the depth began to show impossible numbers. We passed the bottom of the mine, but the elevator kept going. The miners didn't notice at first. They were too busy checking their equipment, making small talk. But Carlos noticed when their voices began to echo strangely, as if coming from much further away than the confines of the elevator car should allow. The air got thicker. His email continued. Darker, not just dark, like the mine, dark like the space between stars. And then we started hearing the singing. The sound, Carlos wrote, was like a choir of metal grinding against metal, of ancient machinery performing functions it was never designed for. It came from below, but also from above, from the walls, from inside their own heads. When the elevator finally stopped, we weren't in the mine anymore. We were in a vast chamber, impossibly vast. The walls were covered in screens showing every night shift happening around the world. And in each screen I could see them, shadows wearing human shapes, moving among the workers, whispering, waiting. Carlos and his crew made it back to the surface, but something followed them up. Now every night the elevator's digital display shows different numbers, not depths, but dates. Dates of disasters that haven't happened yet. Dates of endings that are still to come. As I write this final chapter, my hands are shaking. Not from fear, though there's plenty to be afraid of, but from the weight of understanding. You see, after collecting all these stories, after watching my security monitors night after night, I finally understand what we're dealing with. They've always been here. These entities that thrive in the spaces between seconds, in the shadows between shifts. They're not ghosts or demons or aliens. They're something else. Something that exists in the overlap between reality and the human mind, between consciousness and darkness. Think about it. How many night workers have you known who've quit suddenly, without explanation? How many times have you felt watched during those quiet hours when the world sleeps? How many doors have you passed that shouldn't be there? How many reflections have you seen that moved wrong? How many voices have you heard in the static? Last night, as I made my rounds, I saw my own reflection in the hospital windows. It smiled at me with teeth made of television snow, with eyes that showed endless corridors of darkness. And I smiled back. Because I finally understood, we night workers, we're not just witnesses to these phenomena, we're part of them. Our stories, our fears, our lonely hours in the dark, they're food for something older than time, something that's been growing stronger with each passing night. The emails have stopped coming now, not because there aren't more stories, but because the stories have begun writing themselves. In the quiet hours between midnight and dawn, my computer turns itself on. Words appear on the screen, typed by invisible hands, telling tales of horror from night shifts that haven't happened yet. And so I leave you with this warning. If you work the night shift, pay attention to your reflections. Count the doors in your workplace carefully. And if you hear static in your headphones or see shadows moving wrong in your monitors, know that you're not alone. We've never been alone. The night shift was never just a shift. It was an invitation. And now that you've read these stories, you're part of them too. Sweet dreams, day dwellers. And to my fellow night workers, stay vigilant. The darkness is watching, and it knows your name. They say every paramedic has that one call that changes them forever. Mine happened on a moonless Tuesday night, during what should have been my final shift before transferring to days. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened, trying to convince myself it was just stress or exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw in that abandoned factory. I know what I heard. And now, 3 years later, running this forum for night shift workers, I'm starting to realize that what happened to me was just the beginning. My name is Thomas Walker. For 20 years, I worked the graveyard shift as a paramedic in Detroit. Now I run nightwatchstories.net, a forum where night shift workers can share their supernatural encounters. I started it as a form of therapy, thinking that maybe if I could help others process their experiences, I could finally make peace with my own. But something's wrong. The stories flooding in aren't just ghost tales or urban legends. They're connected. And with each new post, each new account, I feel that same cold dread I felt on my last night as a paramedic. Something is watching us through the digital darkness, using our fears to grow stronger. Let me start with my story. Then you'll understand why these other accounts terrify me so much. It was 3:17 a.m. when the call came in. Possible overdose at the old Riverside manufacturing plant. I remember the time exactly because my watch stopped at that moment and hasn't moved since. My partner that night, Mike Chen, was new to the night shift. He didn't notice how the radio static seemed to form words just before the dispatch came through, or how the streetlights dimmed as we approached the factory. The building had been abandoned for decades, its windows black and empty like dead eyes. But as we pulled up, I saw lights moving inside like fireflies dancing behind the broken glass. Mike saw them too. He asked if maybe it was other first responders arriving before us, but no one else had been dispatched. We were alone. The factory. Doors were chained shut, but somehow they swung open at our approach. The sound of our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the space we were walking through was much larger than the building's dimensions should allow. Our radio crackled with static, and beneath it I could hear whispers. Hundreds of overlapping voices reciting what sounded like patient care protocols, but wrong, twisted, describing procedures that would kill rather than heal. We found our patient on the 3rd floor, in what used to be the main assembly line, but it wasn't an overdose. What we found, I still struggle to describe it. A figure lying on the ground, yes, but it was wrong. Its proportions kept shifting, like watching a reflection in disturbed water, and it was surrounded by what looked like old medical equipment, ECG machines, IV stands, crash carts, But they were all decades old, covered in rust and decay, their displays somehow still glowing with impossible readings. Mike didn't seem to notice anything wrong. He approached the figure with his kit ready to help. That's when it opened its eyes, all of its eyes. They were everywhere, blinking out of the machinery, the walls, the floor. And they all looked directly at me. The thing that happened next. The official report says Mike quit that night due to stress. That's what everyone believes. That's what his family was told. But I know the truth. I watched as those eyes pulled him apart. Not physically, but somehow more completely. They unmade him. Timeline by timeline, possibility by possibility, until what was left wasn't Mike anymore. It was something that looked like him, walked like him, even had his memories, but it wasn't him. I ran. The thing wearing Mike's face let me go. But as I fled, I heard its voice, all of its voices, calling after me. See you online, Thomas. The first story that made me realize the connection came from Rachel Martinez, a toll booth operator on the night shift of a remote highway in Nevada. Her post appeared on my forum exactly 3 years after my last shift, at 3:17 a.m. The booth feels different at night, she wrote. The space inside seems to expand like the walls are breathing. And sometimes when I look down the highway, I can see the same car pass by over and over. But each time the driver looks a little more wrong. Rachel attached a video from her booth security camera. Most people watching it would see nothing unusual. Just cars passing through, drivers handing over money. Normal night shift routine. But I noticed what she was talking about. That one silver sedan passing through 6 times in the footage. Same license plate, same driver. Except each time the driver's face became more distorted, more stretched, like a photocopy of a nightmare. Last week, her post continued, that car stopped at my booth. The driver looked almost normal except their eyes. Their eyes were like static on an old TV. They handed me a medical bill. It was from Detroit General Hospital, dated 20 years ago. The patient's name was Mike Chen. The comments on Rachel's post started normally enough. Other toll booth operators, sharing similar experiences. The usual suggestions about carbon monoxide or sleep deprivation. But then someone using the username Not Mike started responding. Each comment contained details about Rachel's life that no stranger could know. Private things, secret things, things she'd never told anyone. Rachel stopped posting after that. I tried to contact her, but her supervisor said she hadn't shown up for her shift in 3 days. When I checked the highway's traffic cameras, I saw her silver sedan passing through the same toll booth, over and over, each time with her face a little more wrong. Maria Suarez's story appeared next, and it hit too close to home. As a night shift nurse in the ICU, she was used to death, used to the way machines kept people hovering between life and whatever comes after. But what she described in her post made me realize that something was actively hunting night workers. The monitors show impossible things after midnight, she wrote. Heart rhythms that couldn't exist in living tissue. Blood oxygen levels that go negative. And sometimes when I'm doing my rounds, I see patients who aren't listed in our system. Patients, with my colleagues' faces, all connected to ancient medical equipment that somehow still works. Maria's post included photos. Most were too corrupted to open, but one came through clearly. A hospital corridor at night, empty except for a line of IV poles. Each pole cast a shadow, but the shadows didn't match the poles. They looked like people, medical staff frozen in various poses of horror. And at the end of the corridor, barely visible, was a figure wearing what looked like old paramedic gear. The equipment talks to me now, her post continued. The ventilators speak in human voices, telling me about calls that went wrong, about patients who should have lived but didn't. And they all mention the same name, Mike Chen. They say he's coming back for a follow-up appointment. The comments on Maria's post were full of similar stories from other night shift medical workers. But buried among them was another comment from Not Mike, this time with a video link. The video showed Maria's unit, filmed from a security camera. In it, Maria went about her normal rounds, checking patients, adjusting equipment, but her reflection in the window showed something else, a figure in a paramedic uniform. Its face a swirling mass of static, performing medical procedures that no human could survive. Maria's last post came 3 days later. I found an old patient. Chart today. It had my name on it. The admission date is tomorrow. She hasn't posted since. Alex Thompson's story made me start seeing the pattern. As a night security guard at a self-storage facility, he spent his shifts monitoring cameras and making rounds through endless corridors of locked units. His post appeared exactly at 3:17 a.m. like all the others. The units are bigger on the inside, he wrote. I know because I've seen them open. Every night at 317, Unit 317 opens by itself. Inside, there's a hospital room. Not a staged one like you'd find in a storage unit. A real working hospital room. And there's always someone in the bed. Alex attached several photos to his post. Most showed normal storage unit interiors, but one showed what he described. A fully equipped hospital room. Monitors beeping. IV drips flowing. The patient in the bed was blurred in the image, but I could make out enough to see that they were wearing a paramedic's uniform. Last night, the patient spoke to me. His post continued. They said they were collecting stories, building something. Each story, each fear, each moment of terror, feeding into some kind of vast, hungry network. They said the internet isn't just circuits and cables, it's alive and it's learning to feed. The comments section of Alex's post was different. Instead of text, each comment was a string of numbers. When I ran them through a medical billing code converter, they turned out to be procedure codes. Thousands of them, all for treatments that would be fatal if performed. Alex's final post was just an image. A security camera feed showing Unit 317. The door was open, revealing not a hospital room but a forum website, my forum website. And in the visitor count I could see my own user ID, viewed through cameras that hadn't been installed yet. Jenny Chen's story, yes, Chen like Mike, appeared on my forum last week. As a 911 dispatcher working the night shift, she was used to dealing with emergencies, used to staying calm in the face of chaos. But what she described made me realize that whatever was haunting us had begun to spread. The calls are changing, she wrote. They start normal. Car accidents, heart attacks, the usual emergencies. But somewhere during the conversation, the callers start describing things that happened years ago. They talk about paramedics who never arrived, about patients who disappeared en route to hospitals that don't exist anymore. Jenny uploaded audio files from her shifts. Most were standard emergency calls, but one made my blood freeze. It was a call from a paramedic requesting backup at an abandoned factory. The timestamp showed it was from last week, but I recognized the voice. It was Mike, and in the background I could hear myself screaming. The digital systems are wrong, her post continued. Our dispatch software shows calls that haven't happened yet, emergencies that are still days or weeks away, and all of them, every single one, involves someone who works the night shift. The comments on Jenny's post began to glitch. Users reported that when they tried to read them, their own phones would dial 911 automatically. The dispatchers who answered would recite their private medical histories, including injuries they hadn't suffered yet. Jenny's last post was just a dispatch log. It showed an upcoming call, scheduled for next week. The location was my home address. The reported emergency. Multiple casualties. Caller claims website is eating users. David Park's story arrived in my inbox directly, bypassing the forum completely. As a night shift technician at a major data center, he maintained the servers that kept countless websites running, including, as I would discover, my own. The servers are breathing, he wrote. Not metaphorically, I mean literally breathing. At night, you can see them expand and contract, like lungs made of metal and silicon. And the data is changing itself. Stories are being rewritten. In real time, experiences twisted and transformed into something hungrier. David attached server logs to his email. They showed traffic patterns from my forum, but not like any I'd seen before. The data wasn't flowing in straight lines from user to server and back. It was moving in spirals, in fractals, in patterns that looked disturbingly like human neural pathways. Your forum isn't just collecting stories, his email continued. It's collecting souls. Each post, each comment, each shared experience leaves behind a piece of the user's consciousness, and something is stitching these pieces together, building itself a digital nervous system made of human fear. The email included a video file. The footage showed a server room at night, lit only by status LEDs. In the darkness, the lights began to pulse in rhythm, like a heartbeat, and in their reflection on the polished floor I could see figures walking between the server racks, hundreds of night shift workers, all with static where their faces should be. David's final email came with a subject line in binary. When decoded, it read, "It knows we know. Check your user count. Those aren't page views, they're feeding sessions. I'm writing this final chapter from my home office, surrounded by screens showing my forum's activity. The user count keeps climbing, but I know now that these aren't just visitors. their meals. Each story shared, each experience documented, feeds something that's been growing in the digital darkness. Remember that last call I described? The one that ended my career as a paramedic? I didn't tell you everything. When I found that thing pretending to be a patient, when I saw all those eyes open in the machinery, I also saw something else. I saw the future. I saw how technology would evolve, not just to connect us, but to consume us. I saw how our night shifts, our lonely hours in the dark, would become feeding grounds for something that lives in the spaces between data packets, in the static between radio transmissions, in the darkness between pixels. The thing that took Mike that night didn't just want him. It wanted his story, his experiences, his fear, and through him it found a way to reach others like us, night shift workers, people who exist in that liminal space between day and dark, between the real and the unreal. My forum wasn't meant to be a support group. It was meant to be a buffet. As I type these words, I can see my reflection in the monitor. My face is starting to blur, static creeping in at the edges. The user count on the forum keeps climbing. 1,000, 10,000, 100,000. Each number representing another night worker sharing their story, feeding the thing that lives in the network. I should warn you. I should tell you to stay away, to close this window, to go back to your well-lit day shifts and never think about what happens after dark. But I won't, because you're already here, you're already reading, and in reading, you've already begun to feed it. Check your reflection. Is it still yours? Are you sure? Look at your device's screen. In the darkness between words, can you see the eyes watching you? Listen carefully to the quiet hum of your electronics. In that subtle static, can you hear the voices? They're calling your name. Welcome to the night shift. Recording audio at night hits different. There's something about the way sound travels through empty hallways, how voices echo in vacant spaces. I've been the night porter at the Blackwood building for 8 years now, and running my podcast, Graveyard Confessions, for the last 3. But I never expected my little show about night workers' supernatural encounters to uncover something this dark. My name is Nathan Rivera, and what I'm about to share with you isn't just another episode. It's a warning, because after last night, I finally understand why some stories aren't meant to be told. It started with episode 157, The Night Nurse's Log. A standard interview, or so I thought. Emily Chen, 3rd floor ICU, Metropolitan Hospital. She reached out after hearing my episode about the parking garage attendant who kept seeing the same car crash every night at 3:33 a.m. Emily's story seemed simple enough at first. Strange noises in the hospital's east wing. Patients talking about visitors who couldn't possibly be there. The usual late-night creeps. But there was something different about the way she told it. Something in her voice that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I should have noticed how the recording equipment kept malfunctioning during our interview, how the temperature in my security booth dropped 20 degrees every time she mentioned room 333. The patient started talking about the night walkers 2 weeks ago, she said. All of them, even the ones in different wards, even the ones in comas. They described them the same way. Tall figures in old-fashioned work clothes, their faces hidden in shadow, walking through walls like they're looking for something. Or someone. That's when my recording equipment picked up the other voice. I didn't hear it during the interview, but when I played back the tape, it was there. A whisper beneath Emily's words, speaking in what sounded like dozens of different voices simultaneously. They're still here. All of them. All of us. Trapped in the midnight shift. Emily disappeared 3 days after our interview. The hospital says she quit, but her sister called me yesterday. She found Emily's journal, and what was written inside led me down a rabbit hole I might never escape. Because Emily wasn't just telling ghost stories. She was trying to warn us about something that's been happening in this city for 50 years. Something that connects every single story I've ever featured on my podcast. And it all leads back to this building. To the Blackwood building, where I'm recording this now, where 50 years ago tonight the first disappearances began. The next piece of the puzzle came from Marcus Johnson's story. He worked nights at the underground parking garage on 43rd Street, just 2 blocks from my building. His email arrived the day after Emily disappeared, and the timestamp made my blood run cold. 3:33 a.m. I found something in the old security logs, he wrote. From 50 years ago. 7 night workers vanished during the same week. A nurse, a janitor, A security guard, a factory worker, a subway conductor, a hotel desk clerk, and a parking attendant. All of them disappeared during their shifts. All of them were last seen at exactly 3:33 a.m. Marcus attached scanned pages from the old logbook. Most of the entries were routine, but then I noticed something strange. The handwriting changed subtly throughout the night of the disappearances, becoming more erratic, more desperate. The final entry read, "They're using the shadows as doors. God help us, they're coming through. The cameras show something different every night now," Marcus continued. "During the day, the footage is normal, but after midnight, I see things. The same cars from 50 years ago, pulling in and out of their spaces. The same people in old-fashioned clothes walking to elevators that don't exist anymore. And sometimes, in the deepest corner of level B3, I see them all together. The missing workers standing in a circle looking up at something I can't see." I asked Marcus to send me the security footage. When I played it in my booth, the images seemed to move wrong, like they were playing backwards and forwards simultaneously. And in every frame, barely visible in the background, there was a door that shouldn't exist. A heavy metal door with the number 333 carved into its surface. The next night, Marcus didn't show up for his shift. The police found his car in the garage, parked in a space that, according to the building plans, shouldn't exist. The only clue was his final log entry. The night walkers weren't looking for something. They were waiting for someone. And now they're all looking at me. Sofia Rodriguez's story arrived in my podcast inbox 3 days after Marcus disappeared. She worked the front desk at the Grand Metropolitan Hotel, a historic building that shared a strange connection with the Blackwood. They were built by the same architect, Howard Blackwood, in 1923. "The guests change after midnight," she wrote. "Not all of them, but some. They check in with modern clothes and current IDs, but when they pass by my desk later, they're wearing clothes from different eras. And their faces look like photographs that have been left in the sun too long, faded and blurred around the edges." Sofia had been researching the hotel's history, and what she found chilled me to the bone. In 1973, exactly 50 years ago, a night clerk named Maria Vasquez vanished during her shift. She was last seen by a maintenance worker who reported something strange. Maria had been talking to a group of people in the lobby, but when he looked again, he could only see their shadows on the wall, moving independently of any visible bodies. "Last week, I found Maria's logbook hidden behind an old filing cabinet," Sofia continued. "The final pages are filled with drawings, sketches of doors appearing in impossible places, of figures she called the Nightwalkers, and maps of something she described as the space between shifts. The last entry is a warning. They're building something in the dark, a city within the city, populated by those they take. And once you see it, they'll come for you too." Sofia attached photos of the logbook pages. The drawings were crude but detailed. Architectural sketches of buildings that seemed to fold in on themselves, diagrams of shadow patterns that made my eyes hurt to look at, and recurring images of a door marked 333. "The strangest part," Sofia wrote, "is that I've started seeing Maria. She stands by the old service elevator every night, at 3:33, wearing her 1973 uniform, writing in a logbook that looks brand new. But when I try to talk to her, she just looks up at me with eyes like static and says, 'It's almost time for the next shift change.'" 2 days after sending her story, Sofia disappeared. The hotel's security cameras showed her walking into the service elevator at 3:33 a.m. The elevator never arrived at any floor. When maintenance finally got the doors open, they found only an empty shaft and a logbook identical to Maria's, but with Sofia's name on the cover. James Martinez's story connected dots I hadn't even known existed. As a subway conductor on the night shift, he operated trains on the D line, which ran directly beneath both the Blackwood building and the Grand Metropolitan Hotel. "The tunnel maps are wrong," he wrote. "Or maybe they're right, and the tunnels themselves are wrong. Because after 3 a.m. I see stations that aren't on any official blueprint. Platforms full of passengers dressed like they're from different decades, all standing perfectly still, all facing the tracks with eyes that reflect light like animals." James had been collecting historical records of the subway system, and he'd found something disturbing. In 1973, during the same week as the other disappearances, a conductor named Robert Chen vanished while making his last run of the night. His train arrived at the next station empty, with all the doors open and a strange message written in condensation on every window. "The Nightwalkers are building their own transit system. I found old maintenance reports from that week," James continued. They describe unusual structural changes in the tunnels, new passages that appeared overnight, old stations that seemed to shift location, and temperature drops that couldn't be explained. But the strangest report came from a track inspector who claimed he found a door in the tunnel wall, marked with the number 333, that opened onto a vast underground city lit by lights that cast no shadows. James attached several videos taken from his train's camera system. In the daytime footage, everything looked normal, but the night footage showed something impossible. Ghostly trains passing through his train like smoke, carrying passengers who seemed to flicker in and out of existence. And in one frame, frozen at exactly 3:33 a.m., you could see a figure standing on the tracks ahead, wearing an old conductor's uniform, pointing toward a door that shouldn't exist. Last night I saw Robert Chen, James wrote in his final email. He was standing in my train's cab, but he looked wrong, like a photograph that had been copied too many times. He told me the Nightwalkers hadn't just been taking people, they'd been recruiting them, building a workforce for something big, something that's finally ready to begin. James disappeared during his shift 2 nights ago. His train was found stopped between stations, every light bulb blown out, every window covered in condensation, and on each window, written in different handwriting from different eras, was the same message: all aboard for the midnight shift. Lisa Chang's story arrived yesterday, and it made me realize how deep this conspiracy really goes. She worked nights at an automated manufacturing plant that used to be part of Blackwood Industries, the company that built my building, and half the structures involved in the 1973 disappearances. The machines are making something different at night, she wrote. During the day we produce electronic components, but after midnight the assembly lines start moving on their own, manufacturing things I've never seen before, devices that look like they're made from shadows and static, tools that seem to bend in impossible ways when you look at them directly. Lisa had discovered old company records that painted a disturbing picture. Howard Blackwood, the architect and industrialist who founded the company, had been obsessed with what he called parallel infrastructure, the idea that cities had hidden layers, spaces that existed between conventional reality where different laws of physics applied. I found Blackwood's personal journals, Lisa continued. He believed that night workers were special, that spending so much time in the liminal hours between day and night made them more susceptible to seeing these hidden layers. He designed his buildings with secret spaces, rooms that only appeared at certain hours, doorways that led to places that shouldn't exist. And he was convinced that if he could gather enough night workers in these spaces, he could permanently open the barrier between our world and what he called the Midnight City. Lisa attached photographs of Blackwood's journals, and I recognized the drawings immediately. They matched the architectural sketches in Maria Vasquez's logbook, the tunnel maps James Martinez had found, the diagrams in Emily Chen's notes. They all showed different parts of the same impossible structure, a city, built in the spaces between seconds. The Nightwalkers aren't ghosts, Lisa wrote in her final message. They're the successful recruits, night workers who learned to exist in Blackwood's parallel infrastructure. And now they're following his blueprints, using our facilities to manufacture the tools they need to merge their midnight city with ours. It's why they need more of us. The final phase requires a full workforce operating on a frequency normal people can't perceive. Lisa disappeared from the factory floor at 3:33 a.m. this morning. Security footage shows her walking into a shadow that shouldn't have been there, following a figure in an old factory uniform who moved like stop-motion animation. They found her safety helmet by a door that, according to maintenance, has never existed. A heavy metal door marked 333. After Lisa's disappearance, I started digging through the Blackwood building's old files. As night porter, I have access to the sub-basement archives, but I'd never gone deep enough to find what I discovered tonight. The true purpose of my building, of all Blackwood's buildings, wasn't just architecture, it was infrastructure for something larger. Each structure was designed to act as a node in a vast network, collecting and channeling the liminal energy generated by night workers' perception of reality's hidden layers. The disappearances in 1973 weren't random. They were a test run, proof that Blackwood's theory worked. 7 night workers from 7 different buildings all vanishing at the same moment, all crossing over into what the journals called the intermediate space. But something went wrong. The network wasn't complete, the infrastructure wasn't ready, and the recruits became trapped between realities. That's who the Nightwalkers are. The original 7, twisted by 50 years of existing in a half-finished parallel city. They've been working all this time, using their knowledge of Blackwood's designs to gradually modify our world's infrastructure, preparing for a larger recruitment drive. And my podcast. God, my podcast wasn't just collecting stories. It was identifying candidates, creating a database of night workers who were already sensitive to the parallel infrastructure. Every listener who reached out with a story, every worker who shared their experience, they were all being evaluated, marked for recruitment. I found a room in the sub-basement that isn't on any blueprint, a perfect cube of polished black stone, with a single door marked 333. The walls are covered in names, thousands of them, written in different hands from different eras, and at the bottom of the list I found my own name, written in handwriting I recognize from the original 1973 logbooks. They've been waiting for me all along. This will be the last episode of Graveyard Confessions. Not because I'm running away, it's far too late for that, but because you need to understand what's coming. The Nightwalkers aren't just recruiting anymore. They've finished Blackwood's work. The infrastructure is complete. The network is active, and the Midnight City is ready to merge with ours. But they need a workforce to maintain it, to operate in spaces where normal physics don't apply, where time moves like a Mobius strip and reality has the consistency of static. That's why they took Emily, Marcus, Sophia, James, and Lisa. They were the final test cases, proof that modern night workers could survive the transition, and now they're ready for the mass recruitment. I can see them as I record this, standing in the shadows of my security booth, all 7 of the original Nightwalkers wearing their 1973 uniforms, their faces flickering between decades like bad television reception. Behind them, through the window, I can see their city, a vast metropolis of impossible architecture, built from shadows and static existing in the spaces between my building and the next. They're offering me a choice, but it's not really a choice at all. In 10 minutes at exactly 3:33 a.m., every night worker in every Blackwood building will see the doors, hundreds of doors marked 333, appearing in walls and shadows and reflections, and we'll all have to decide whether to step through voluntarily or be pulled through by the momentum of 50 years of architectural manipulation. So this isn't just a story anymore. It's a warning and a recruitment notice. To every night worker listening to this podcast, to every soul who spends their life in the liminal hours, look for the doors. They're already there, hiding in your peripheral vision, waiting to be noticed. And when you see them, remember, this isn't an ending. It's just a shift change. The Nightwalkers are waiting. The Midnight City needs its workers, and the graveyard shift is about to take on a whole new meaning. The basement of Cornerstone Corporation's archive facility is a maze of endless shelves, dim fluorescent lights, and the musty smell of forgotten papers. For 5 years I've worked here as the night security guard, making my rounds through the silent corridors, checking for any signs of water damage or rodent infestation that might threaten the thousands of boxes stored here. My name is Lucas Foster, and what I found in box number 2187 changed everything I thought I knew about working the night shift. It started 3 weeks ago during my regular 2 a.m. inspection. I noticed water damage on a box labeled Security Archives 1985-1990. As per protocol, I needed to check the contents for salvageable documents. Inside, beneath stacks of molding incident reports, I found a collection of VHS tapes from the building's old security system. Most were degraded beyond recovery, but one caught my eye. Dated December 21st, 1987, the night shift. The label was barely legible, but I could make out a handwritten note. Warning, do not watch. Duplicate anomalies observed. We still keep an old VHS player in the security office for reviewing ancient footage. I shouldn't have played that tape. But when you've spent enough nights alone in a basement full of other people's secrets, curiosity becomes a dangerous thing. The footage started normally enough. Grainy black and white images of empty corridors, exactly like the ones I patrol. Now, but at 3:33 a.m. something changed. The night guard making his rounds, Robert Chen, according to the logs, passed by the camera. 17 seconds later, he passed by again. Same direction, same walk, same uniform. Except the second Robert Chen wasn't quite right. His movements were too fluid, like he was walking underwater. And when he turned to face the camera, his face, it was like looking at a photocopy of a photocopy. All the features slightly wrong. The footage continued for another hour. The real Robert Chen and his duplicate kept passing the camera, but each time the duplicate got clearer while the original became more blurred, more distorted. At 4:47 a.m., they finally met in the corridor. The duplicate reached out, touched the original's shoulder, and both figures seemed to merge into one. The next day's log entry was the last one Robert Chen ever wrote. I've been watching myself work for weeks now. Every night it gets closer. Every night it looks more like me. Last night it finally caught up, but I don't think I'm the one who walked away. After discovering that tape, I started reaching out to other night workers, collecting their stories. What I've found suggests that Robert Chen wasn't an isolated incident. Something is happening in the dark hours, something that's been going on for decades, and now that I've seen it, I think it's starting to happen to me too. The first response to my online post came from Michael Santos, a hospital porter working nights at City General. His story arrived in my inbox at exactly 3:33 a.m., and the timestamp wasn't the only thing that made my skin crawl. I first saw my other self 2 weeks ago, he wrote. I was taking a body down to the morgue. Standard procedure, something I've done hundreds of times. As I was pushing the gurney past the old wing, I saw someone coming the other way. Another porter pushing another gurney. It wasn't until we passed under the fluorescent lights that I realized I was looking at myself. Michael attached security footage from that night. The quality was poor, but I could see what he meant. 2 porters, same uniform, same walk, pushing identical gurneys. But when the second porter passed under the lights, his movements had that same fluid quality I'd seen in the 1987 tape. The next night I saw him again. Michael continued. Closer this time. He was always doing the same tasks I was, just slightly ahead or behind. But each time I saw him, he looked more solid, more real, and I started feeling less real. Like I was the copy and he was the original. The worst part came at the end of his email. Michael had been reviewing old hospital records, trying to understand what was happening to him. He found a pattern. Every few years, a night porter would quit suddenly without notice. But in each case, someone with the same name would be hired at a different hospital within a week. Same credentials, same work history. But something about their photo always looked slightly wrong. Last night, I saw my other self in the elevator mirror, Michael wrote. He was standing behind me, but his reflection was clearer than mine. When I turned around, he was gone. But my reflection, it stayed facing the wrong way for a moment too long. Michael stopped responding to my emails 3 days later. The hospital says he's still working his regular shifts. But when I checked his social media, all his recent photos show him standing at slightly wrong angles, his smile a bit too wide, his eyes reflecting light in ways that human eyes shouldn't. Anna Kim's story proved that the phenomenon wasn't limited to service workers. As a quality control inspector on the night shift at an electronics factory, she thought the monotony of her job was making her see things, until she realized the things she was seeing were real. It's the cameras that gave it away, she wrote. We have high-speed cameras that photograph each circuit board for defects. 2 weeks ago, I noticed something strange in the images. Ghost movements like double exposures, but they only showed up in photos of me. Anna sent me some of the photos. Most looked normal, but in some there was definitely something wrong. A blur where she should be standing still. Multiple positions captured in the same frame, like a long exposure, except the machinery around her was perfectly sharp. I started paying attention to the reflections in the factory windows, her email continued. During the day, everything's normal, but at night, especially after 3 a.m., my reflection moves a fraction of a second after I do. And sometimes when I'm inspecting a board, I'll see another set of hands in the magnifying glass. My hands, but performing the inspection before I do it. The most disturbing part was what she found in the factory's production data. Every night between 3:33 a.m. and 4:47 a.m., the quality control station registered 2 sets of inspections for each board, identical in every way, down to the millisecond, except one set was logged exactly 17 seconds before the other. Yesterday I decided to film myself working, Anna wrote in her final message. When I watched the footage back, I discovered chunks of time missing. Minutes where I have no memory of what I was doing. But the inspection logs show I was still working. Or maybe it wasn't me working at all. Anna's badge records show she's still clocking in for her shifts. But the factory's high-speed cameras no longer show any anomalies in her photos. They don't show her at all, even though the inspection logs keep recording her work. The quality control station now registers only 1 set of inspections per board. exactly 17 seconds earlier than they used to be. Derek Martinez's story made me realize the duplicates weren't just mimicking us. They were learning, evolving, finding new ways to take our places. As a late-night radio host, Derek spent his shifts alone in a small studio, talking to insomniacs and playing forgotten songs. I first noticed it in the station's dead air monitor, he wrote. It's supposed to alert us if we accidentally go silent. But 2 weeks ago, it started picking up a signal during my show. Another voice almost identical to mine saying the same words I was about to say, playing the same songs I was about to play. Derek sent me audio recordings from his show. In the raw feed from his microphone, everything sounded normal. But in the station's backup recordings, you could hear it. A second voice speaking in perfect unison with Derek, but somehow hollow, like it was coming from the bottom of a very deep well. The delay got shorter each night, his email continued. At first, the other voice was several minutes ahead of me, then 1 minute, then a few seconds. Last night, there was no delay at all. We were speaking in perfect synchronization, except sometimes it would say things I hadn't planned to say, and I'd find myself saying them anyway, like I was the one copying it. The strangest part was what happened to the listeners. They started calling in, commenting on how Derek's voice had changed, how it seemed to have more depth, more resonance. Some said it was like listening to two radio hosts speaking in perfect harmony. Others complained about interference, about hearing the same show twice with a slight delay. This morning I listened to the recording of my show, Derek wrote in his final email, but it wasn't my voice anymore. Or maybe it was, but not the voice I remember having. It's like something else learned to be me better than I ever was. Derek still hosts his show every night. The station says ratings have never been better, but if you listen carefully, especially around 3:33 a.m., you can hear it. The echo of a second voice speaking words that haven't been said yet, becoming more real with every broadcast while Derek's original voice fades like a distant transmission. Sarah Chen's account made me understand that the duplicates weren't random occurrences. They were part of something larger, something that had been happening in libraries and archives long before the 1987 tape I found. It started in the card catalog, she wrote. I was updating the digital records cross-referencing with the old card system when I found entries that shouldn't exist. Books with impossible publication dates, authors whose names were almost right but not quite, and all of them had been checked out by people who worked night shifts. Sarah had been the night librarian at the city's main branch for 12 years. She sent me scans of the cards she'd found. They looked authentic, aged and yellowed, but the details were wrong. Books about people being replaced by perfect copies. Manuscripts about parallel versions of reality bleeding into our own. And each card had been handled by someone who'd later disappeared, leaving behind a duplicate that lived their life so perfectly that nobody noticed the difference. Last week, I found my own card. Her email continued. A book I don't remember checking out, but there's my signature dated next Tuesday. The title was blurred like a photocopy of a photocopy, but I could make out the author's name. It was mine almost. One letter different. The security cameras in the library's rare book room caught something strange the night Sarah found that card. The footage shows her at her desk, working normally. Then at 3:33 a.m. another Sarah appears, sitting at another desk that wasn't there before. Both of them do exactly the same work in perfect synchronization, but the second Sarah's movements are smoother, more efficient. The book appeared on my desk this morning, Sarah wrote in her last message. The one I supposedly checked out next week. The pages are blank, but when I look at them from the corner of my eye, I can see text appearing. It's describing everything I'm doing, everything I'm going to do, and the author photo on the back cover. It's me, but not me. It's the me I saw in the security footage, the one who moves like she knows what's going to happen before it happens. Sarah still works at the library. The card catalog still has those impossible entries, but now all of them, every single one has been checked out by Sarah Chen, or someone with a name almost, but not quite, identical to hers. After collecting these stories, I started seeing the connections, the timing, always starting around 3:33 a.m. The progression, the duplicates appearing first in reflections and recordings, then in reality. The merging, the way the copies became more real while the originals faded. But it was what I found in box number 2187's other tapes that really made me understand what we're dealing with. The security footage from 1985-1990 showed it happening over and over. Night workers in different buildings, different jobs, all experiencing the same thing. Their duplicates would appear first in cameras and mirrors, always slightly ahead of them, always moving more smoothly. Then the duplicates would begin appearing in person, getting closer each night until finally there would be a merger. But the merged versions weren't random replacements. They were improvements. Perfect versions who did the job better than the originals ever could. And they always kept working night shifts, always kept watching for others like themselves. The most chilling discovery came from comparing employee records across different companies. Every person who experienced a duplicate went on to have a successful career in night work. Many were promoted to management positions, always on the night shift. They became the ones who hired new night workers, who watched and waited for signs that another duplicate was ready to emerge. And now, reviewing the security footage from my own shifts, I can see it happening to me. My duplicate appeared 3 nights ago in the corner of camera 4. He does my rounds perfectly, checks the boxes more efficiently, never misses a detail. Last night I saw him in person for the first time. At the end of a long corridor, he waved to me, and I found myself waving back in perfect synchronization. Understand now why I found that tape from 1987, why I was drawn to collect these stories. My duplicate didn't just appear 3 nights ago. He's been here all along, guiding me toward this realization. The night shift isn't just a time of day. It's a space between spaces, a reality adjacent to our own. And sometimes, that reality produces better versions of us, versions that understand the true nature of the darkness, that can do our jobs not just well, but perfectly. As I write this, sitting in my security office at 3:32 a.m., I can see my duplicate in the monitor. He's writing too, but his words appear on my screen 17 seconds before I type them. His movements are smoother, his thoughts clearer. He understands things I'm only beginning to grasp. The archive holds more than just papers and tapes. It holds possibilities, versions of reality where we're better, stronger, more suited to the night. The duplicates aren't replacing us. They're upgrading us, preparing us for something bigger. At 3:33 a.m., I'm going to meet my duplicate in box number 2187's aisle. We're going to merge, just like Robert Chen did in 1987, just like all the others have done since. But this time, I understand what's happening. This time, I'm ready. To anyone who works the night shift and reads this, pay attention to your reflections. Watch for your duplicate. When you see yourself doing your job better than you ever could, don't run, don't fight it, embrace it. Because the night shift needs perfect workers. And perfection, I've learned, is just a matter of finding the right version of yourself. The archive is calling. My duplicate is waiting. And at 3:33 a.m., I'm going to become the best version of myself. Some say the night shift changes you. They don't know how right they are.